Oh, had a lot of fun working for Tandy's and going to the, like I said, to the Boy Scout camps and boys clubs, talking to the boys, um, and YMCA. They had, it wasn't just for the boys. The camp was for girls too, and so we taught the boys and the girls. And had a lot of fun doing it. Um, Somewhere along there, um, Dave Lusky at Lusky's Western Store. I'd done made us one saddle at home, and he decided that we ought to make some saddles. So he got the leather, and we fixed up a little old place in their loft. It was just a little storeroom where I could work, and I built 3 saddles. And one of them was plain slick leather, and a couple of them were rough out. And they looked fair, a lot better than the first one I built in my bedroom at home. And so one day they sat, they sat, they sat, and one day, one morning I come in and I'd left early. At that time I was working 8 hours a day there at the store. And I come in one morning and they said that a couple of young men had come in the evening before and was talking to them and looking at the saddles. And so they said, well, we might be interested in buying several saddles. And they introduced herself as their last name was King. And of course they said they didn't come out and say it, but they hinted that they were a part of the King family of King Ranch. And so everybody got real excited. We were going to build some saddles for King Ranch. And finally somebody woke up to the fact that there was nobody named King at King Ranch, because Mr. King, the Captain King, only had one child. It was a daughter, and she married Mr. King's lawyer, and his name was Kleberg. And so there was never any kings past the original Captain King. So that fell, that big deal fell through before it ever got started. But it was exciting for a little while. We enjoyed it. uh, when back to when I was making belts for Tandy's, I believe that I got $5 a belt. I believe that's what I got for. And but for that I had to dye the background also, and that was before we had the letter stamps that we have today, and so I had to hand cut every letter, and nearly all of the belts had green background. Green background and red seeds in the flowers. You get out on the street with a green background belt now and they look at you, everybody look at you kind of funny. After our unsuccessful attempt at Lusky's with saddles, well, I went down on by the stockyards in Fort Worth, which is the north end of Fort Worth, and that's where most of your saddle shops were at that time. There was 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 saddle shops right there right around the corner of Exchange Avenue and North Main. And I went to work for one. The name of it was L. White Boot and Saddle Shop. They made saddles, they made boots, and from time to time I would tie up a bunch of ropes for them. They weren't known real well for the ropes, but they did sell quite a few. They would buy them in coils, a big coil, and I would string them out, cut them to length, and tied a knot in them and stretch them a little bit, rub them down with some wax paper. But I went to work for White's, L. White's, and I did belts, and they had a saddle maker there that couldn't tool, so I tooled all of his saddles. The L. White shop has a long history in Fort Worth. The White brothers, Vic and Louis, their dad come to Fort Worth in 1898 and opened up a little boot shop down in the southern part. I don't know, I never did know exactly where, but in the southern part of Fort Worth, and stayed there until 1902, I believe it was, when they moved up on North Main and opened the L. White Boot and Saddle Shop. I understand that they didn't make saddles until they opened up that shop. The old shop, they didn't make any saddles. I don't have any idea when Mr. White passed away or turned the shop over to the 2 boys. But Louis was a bootmaker. Vic, I never did see him fool with boots, but he kind of took care of the saddle department. If I was working in the saddle department, and if I had a situation I needed to check on, I always went to Vic. Like I said, I was tooling for this saddle maker that couldn't tool. Back then there were saddle makers, and they were what they call stamp hands. That was the guys that did the tooling on them. Not many saddle makers were toolers, not many toolers were saddle makers. So they needed a I guess if you stay in any workplace very long, you develop the stories that happen, and saddle shops is not any different. I enjoyed working at White's. There was always something going on, and I enjoyed that. At Ryan's, the same thing. I remember, I guess the most significant thing happened while I was at Ryan's was I was working at Ryan's when we heard that President Kennedy had been killed in Dallas. that just always stuck in my mind when I remember Ryan's. I don't know why, but that always comes to mind. We had some pretty colorful characters working there. Um, when you get some cowboys together, you got all kinds of things going on, and most of the time, not always, but a lot of times when you get with leather workers, you're with cowboys too. They're horse people. We had one guy that was, I can't remember anything but Cajun. It's the only thing I ever heard him called. And he was a rodeo clown, part-time. He he'd come in one morning, and he was always coming in and telling stories on Monday morning, things that happened to him over the weekend at a rodeo, and he was always getting bunged up, bull getting a hold of him, and he'd come in limping or sore and rubbing himself. He come in one morning and he was walking really easy. He kind of kept his legs spraddled out a little bit. And somebody asked him what happened, and he said nothing. Just kept on going. Wouldn't talk to anybody about it. And finally, up in the morning, we finally got out of him what had happened. And one of the things that he would do to, help liven the crowd and get them to laughing, he would set off a charge of black powder in the seat of his baggy breeches, and it would cause a big, a little boom and a lot of smoke, and he used that quite a bit. In fact, every show that he went to, he used this, and he got in a hurry getting his charge, everything fixed up for that particular evening. That was a Sunday evening, I think, and he double charged. He, for some reason or another, he put his amount in it that he's supposed to put in, and then got distracted, and then ended up putting it in again. So his backside was pretty sore. It had caused some cuts and abrasions in his skin, and he walked around there nearly all week, kind of tender and easy like, but he got over it and was back at the rodeo the next weekend doing the same thing. He might have skipped the powder thing a time or two until his rear end got healed up, but he kept right on going, and it was something he really enjoyed, so he stayed with it. We had one of my duties is tooling saddles for a saddle maker. Again, that he was a saddle maker, but he didn't tool, so I had the job of tooling his saddles. And after a while, all your leather workers back then worked on piecework. They got so much a saddle. If it was full carved, and they got a certain amount. If it was plain, they got less. For each thing that they did extra on the saddle, they got paid that certain amount for that. And and a lot of times, if it was a oak leaf pattern, you got so much, and if it's a floral pattern, you got so much. If it was just a spot stamp, where you just did a little bit around the corners or something, then you got X number of dollars. But John Posey, I believe was the saddle maker's name. And I worked, I did the stamping on his saddles. I made some bells. I made made breast collars, head stalls, that type of work. Anything that they needed done along that line, well, I got to do them to fill in because John couldn't keep me busy stamping. So they give me this other stuff to fill in, and so that I'd have a decent paycheck at the end of the week. And your saddle makers and all your leather workers got pretty proficient at finishing things by the end of the week so they could get a paycheck. If they didn't finish something or they could turn it in, then they didn't get paid for it. They got paid for the next week. So you worked at finishing whatever you were doing by the end of the week so you could get a paycheck. They had two brothers there, Druce brothers. At this present moment, I don't remember their names, but both of them were saddle makers. Both of them were good saddle makers, and both of them were good carvers, stamp hands, what we called them back then. And they did their own saddles. They carved their own saddles. They decorated their own saddles, and they were real good. Had one saddle maker named Bob Moline, and he was really an artist. He'd be sitting there at his bench waiting for a piece of leather to dry to work on or something, and he'd pick up a piece of scrap and his swivel knife and start cutting in a portrait of somebody across the room or something. He could just do wonders with a piece of leather. And so finally somebody talked him into doing some artwork on leather and entered it in some shows, and he started doing good with it. And finally one of the big banks asked him to put on a private show in their lobby, and he did that, and so that kind of gave him a boost and he got going on it. Eventually he got away from doing the leather and doing oils and watercolors and charcoal. I think he did a little bit of everything. And eventually he got well known in the art world. And so then his hobby became his main income. So he was making a lot more money in his art than he was building saddles. So he quit building saddles and started doing his artwork. And years later, it kind of flipped on him, and then he come back to building saddles. He's still doing art for a living, but then saddles become his hobby. And so he started building a few saddles again, just because he had wanted to get back in it and to keep his hand in it, and he enjoyed it. So he did real good with his artwork. He did real good. We had a young man. He lived in Cleburne. Him and his dad they farmed some land in Cleburne. His name was Johnson, Bud Johnson, and he was really a nice guy. He was a good leather worker. He was more or less the foreman over the shop. He did all of the cutting. None of the saddle makers had to cut their own saddles. Bud selected the leather, blocked out all of the parts, and when the saddle maker got the leather, then it was all blocked out, and all he had to do was fit it and cut it to shape and carve it, stamp it, whatever he needed to do and put it together. And Bud was, that's what Bud did good. and he didn't have to. Actually, did very little bossing. Everybody basically was working for themselves. When you work for piecework, it's your working environment and your working situation is a little bit different. It's a little bit different than just being on an hourly wage. I really enjoyed that type. The few times that I quit leather work and went to working on a salary, it's different. You have to be more, if you're working for yourself with piecework, that's basically what you're doing. You're on your own time. You have to be your own driving force. You have to be, have the will to get up and do the job, because nobody's going to push you unless it's something that really needs to get done. Well, they may come around and say, hey, we need this at a certain time, but nobody's going to be on your back if you slack off a minute and take a rest. So it's a whole lot like working for yourself. I prefer that type. I've always leaned towards that type of work and that kind of working situation. We had, let's see. Eddie Brooks was a saddle maker there. He also did his own carving and stamping. And Eddie was really good. It would be hard to pick out the best saddle maker that we had there at that time. Bob Moline was really good. He was real artistic. The Truce brothers were real good. They had they developed their own style of carving, and at one time Wendy featured their carving in the catalog. Eddie's, he was very meticulous. I saw him take a piece of leather back to Bud many a time and say, Bud, this is not quite good enough. Give me a better piece. And Bud would, of course, would do it. It probably would have worked, and it probably would have been fine,